The dust had barely settled on her boots when Sarah stepped into the Last Chance saloon, her trunk dragging behind her with a stubborn scrape against the wooden floorboards. She'd traveled 3 weeks by train and stagecoach to reach this godforsaken town at the edge of the frontier, answering an advertisement for a school teacher that promised room, board, and a respectable wage. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was that the town of Redemption Ridge consisted of exactly 47 buildings, most of which looked like a strong wind might reduce them to kindling. The saloon keeper, a weathered woman named Martha with silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face, looked up from polishing glasses with an expression somewhere between surprise and resignation. Sarah knew that look well. It was the same look she'd gotten in St. Louis, in Kansas City, and in every other town where her presence challenged expectations. A black woman traveling alone, educated, with plans that extended beyond washing clothes or serving meals, was still a sight that made people recalibrate their assumptions. "I'm Sarah Matthews," she said, setting down her trunk with more force than necessary. "I'm here about the teaching position." Martha's expression shifted, softening into something that might have been approval. "You made it. Mayor Hutchins said you'd written back, but none of us were sure you'd actually come. Room's upstairs, 3rd door on the left. It ain't much, but it's clean." Sarah climbed the narrow staircase, her muscles aching from days of travel, and pushed open the door to what would be her new home. The room was small, barely large enough for the single iron-framed bed pushed against one wall, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a narrow wardrobe that tilted slightly to the left. A single window overlooked the main street, offering a view of the general store, the bank, and the endless expanse of prairie beyond. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. She sat on the bed, testing the mattress, and found it surprisingly comfortable. As she unpacked her few possessions, hanging her 2 good dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her books on the windowsill, she allowed herself a moment of uncertainty. This was further from home than she'd ever been, further from everything familiar and safe. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, warning her that the frontier was no place for a woman alone, especially not a black woman in a time and place where the wounds of war were still fresh and the promises of reconstruction were already beginning to fray. But Sarah had never been one to let fear dictate her choices. She'd earned her teaching certificate through years of night classes, saved every penny from her work as a seamstress, and refused to believe that her dreams should be smaller than anyone else's, simply because of the color of her skin or the circumstances of her birth. If she wanted to teach, to shape young minds, to build something meaningful with her life, then she would do it, even if it meant coming to a place where she might be the only person who looked like her for 100 miles in any direction. That first evening, she ate a simple meal in the saloon's dining area, aware of the curious glances from the other patrons. Most were miners and ranch hands, men whose hands bore the evidence of hard labor, whose faces were carved by sun and wind into permanent squints. They looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and indifference. She kept her head high, her posture straight, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. It was as she was finishing her meal that she first saw him. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun, a tall figure in a dusty coat and wide-brimmed hat. When he stepped inside and removed his hat, she saw a face that was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin, with eyes the color of creek water and hair that fell just past his collar in waves that suggested he was overdue for a trim. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and felt no need to prove it to anyone. Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them. A spark of recognition that had nothing to do with having met before and everything to do with seeing someone and being truly seen in return. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly polite, then nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt weighted with meaning, before turning to speak with Martha at the bar. Sarah turned her attention back to her meal, but she was aware of him in her peripheral vision, the way you're aware of a storm building on the horizon. She heard Martha call him Cole, heard them discussing supplies for his ranch. heard the easy familiarity in their conversation that spoke of years of acquaintance. When she rose to return to her room, she felt his eyes follow her progress across the floor and up the stairs. That night, lying in her narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town, the distant howl of coyotes and the creak of buildings settling, she thought about tomorrow, about standing in front of a classroom for the first time, about the children who would be her students, about building a life in this place that was so far from everything she'd known. And she thought, though she tried not to, about the cowboy with the creek water eyes and the way he'd looked at her as if she were someone worth looking at. The schoolhouse was even smaller than her room at the saloon. A single-room building with rough-hewn benches and a blackboard that had seen better days. But it had windows that let in the morning light, and a small stove for heat, and shelves waiting to be filled with books. Sarah arrived an hour before classes were scheduled to begin, wanting to prepare herself, to arrange the space and gather her thoughts. She was writing the alphabet on the blackboard when she heard the door open behind her. Turning, she expected to see one of her students, but instead found Cole standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a tentative expression on his face that seemed at odds with his confident bearing. "Morning, Miss Matthews," he said, his voice carrying a soft drawl that suggested origins somewhere further south. "I'm Cole Harrison. I own the Triple H Ranch about 5 miles west of town. I wanted to stop by, see if you needed anything, if you were settling in all right." Sarah set down her chalk and brushed the dust from her hands. "That's kind of you, Mr. Harrison. I'm managing well enough." "Thank you." He nodded but didn't leave, instead taking a few steps into the room, looking around at the simple space with an expression that suggested he was measuring it, judging its adequacy. "I heard you came all the way from Missouri. That's quite a journey." "I go where I'm needed," she said simply. "And apparently Redemption Ridge needs a teacher." "That it does. There's a dozen children hereabouts who've been running wild, getting their education from whatever books their folks happen to have, if they have any at all. You'll make a difference here." There was something in his tone, a warmth and sincerity that made her look at him more closely. She saw now that his eyes held a keenness, an intelligence that suggested he was more than just another ranch hand playing at being a cowboy. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a scar that traced along his jawline, barely visible beneath several days' worth of stubble. "I hope to," she said, "though I suspect there will be those who question whether I'm suited for the position." He met her eyes directly, and she saw understanding there, acknowledgement of the unspoken truth between them. "Anyone who questions it is a fool," he said bluntly. "What matters is whether you can teach, not what you look like while doing it. My mother was a teacher back in Texas before the war. She always said teaching was the most important job there was, shaping the next generation. I reckon she was right." Before Sarah could respond, children began arriving, trickling in alone or in small groups, eyeing her with the frank curiosity of the young. Cole nodded to her once more, settled his hat back on his head and left, but not before she caught the smile that played at the corners of his mouth. The first day of teaching was everything she'd hoped and feared. The children ranged in age from 6 to 14, with varying levels of education and attention span. Some could barely read, while others were surprisingly advanced. They tested her boundaries, as children do, trying to see what they could get away with, how far they could push. But Sarah had prepared for this, had studied not just subjects but methods, and she met their challenges with patience and firmness in equal measure. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but exhilarated. She'd done it. She'd stood in front of a classroom and taught, had seen the light of understanding dawn in young eyes, had begun the work of building something real and meaningful. As she locked the schoolhouse door and started back toward the saloon, she felt a sense of accomplishment that warmed her despite the autumn chill that was settling over the prairie. Cole Harrison became a regular presence in her life, though she couldn't quite figure out why. He'd appear at odd moments, always with some practical reason. He brought lumber to repair one of the schoolhouse benches that had cracked. He delivered a load of firewood for the stove, saying he'd had extra. He stopped by one afternoon with a crate of books, saying they'd belonged to his mother and he thought the children might benefit from them. Each time he'd stay for a few minutes, leaning against a desk or doorframe, asking about her day, telling her stories about the ranch and the land and the peculiarities of frontier life. He spoke of cattle drives and winter storms, of the year the creek had flooded and the time he'd tracked a mountain lion for 3 days to protect his herd. He told her about coming to this territory 5 years ago with nothing but determination and a stake he'd earned working other men's ranches, about building the Triple H from the ground up. And slowly, carefully, she began to share her own stories about growing up in Missouri, the daughter of a freed woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion to ensure Sarah had opportunities she'd never had, about learning to read by candlelight, about the teacher who'd seen potential in her and pushed her to pursue an education when everyone else expected her to be satisfied with domestic work, about the dreams that had driven her west, the belief that somewhere beyond the familiar confines of everything she'd known, there might be a place where she could be valued for her mind and her capabilities rather than judged by her appearance. "My mother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear," Cole said one afternoon as autumn deepened into winter and the first snow began to dust the prairie. "It's doing what needs doing even when you're scared to death. I reckon that's what you did coming here." Sarah, who'd been shelving books, paused and looked at him. "And what about you? What brought you here, really? Texas is a long way from Wyoming territory." His expression shifted, becoming distant. "Sometimes you need distance to become who you're meant to be. Texas was my father's dream, his vision of how things should be. I needed to find my own way, build something that was mine. He didn't approve of you leaving? He didn't approve of much where I was concerned. We had different ideas about a lot of things, especially after the war." He fell silent for a moment, then seemed to shake off whatever memories had claimed him. "But that's old history, not worth dwelling on." As weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself looking forward to Cole's visits with an anticipation that both pleased and worried her. She'd come west to build a life centered on teaching, on independence, on proving that she could make her own way in the world. Getting entangled with a man, even one as intriguing as Cole Harrison, hadn't been part of her plan. And yet, she couldn't deny the way her heart lifted when she heard his boots on the schoolhouse steps, the way conversations with him made her feel more fully herself than she had in years. The winter that year was brutal, with blizzards that buried the town under feet of snow and temperatures that plunged so low that water froze solid in its basin overnight. The schoolhouse was impossible to heat adequately, and Sarah often taught with her coat on, her students huddled as close to the stove as safety allowed. On the worst days, when the wind howled like something alive and hungry, classes were canceled, and Sarah found herself confined to her small room at the saloon, reading and rereading her books, practicing lessons for when the weather cleared. It was during one of these storms that Cole appeared at the saloon, snow-covered and half-frozen, having ridden into town through conditions that should have kept everyone sensibly indoors. Martha sent him straight up to Sarah's room with a pot of hot coffee, and Sarah opened her door to find him standing there, his hat in his hands, snow melting in his hair. "I needed to make sure you were all right," he said simply, as if risking his life to check on her was the most natural thing in the world. She ushered him inside, the impropriety of having a man in her room forgotten in the face of his obvious discomfort. He was shivering despite his heavy coat, his lips tinged blue. She poured him coffee, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and scolded him for his foolishness even as something warm and indefinable bloomed in her chest. "You could have died out there," she said, trying to sound angry rather than touched. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about you up here alone, wondering if you had enough wood for your stove, enough food, whether you were warm enough." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. "I was thinking that I couldn't stand not knowing if you were all right." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Outside, the wind battered against the window, but inside, in that small room with its single bed and tilted wardrobe, there was only warmth and the sense of something shifting, settling into a new configuration. "I'm fine," she said softly, "but thank you for caring enough to check." He stayed for an hour, drinking coffee and thawing out, telling her about the ranch and how his men were managing the livestock through the storm. He spoke of his plans for the spring, about expanding his herd, about possibly hiring more hands if he could afford it. And he asked about her life, about her students, about whether she was happy with her decision to come to Redemption Ridge. "I am," she said, surprised by how true it was. "It's not what I expected exactly. It's harder in some ways, easier in others. But I feel like I'm doing something that matters, like I'm building something real." "You are," he said with conviction. "Those children worship you. I've heard them in town, talking about what Miss Matthews taught them, about the books Miss Matthews read to them. You're changing their lives." When he finally left, braving the storm again to return to his ranch, Sarah stood at her window and watched him disappear into the swirling snow. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and acknowledged what she'd been trying to deny. She was falling in love with Cole Harrison, and she had no idea what to do about it. Spring came suddenly, as it often does on the prairie, the snow melting almost overnight to reveal the brown earth beneath. Within weeks, the prairie transformed into a sea of wildflowers, yellow and purple and white stretching to the horizon. Sarah's students were restless with the change of season, eager to be outside rather than cooped up in the schoolhouse, and she found herself ending lessons early on fine days, letting them spill out into the sunshine. Cole invited her to visit the Triple H, and she accepted, curious to see the place he spoke of so often. He collected her on a Saturday morning in a wagon, and they drove west from town into country that grew increasingly beautiful, rolling hills dotted with cattle, creeks running full with snowmelt, and everywhere the sense of space and possibility that defined this territory. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, a sturdy structure of logs and stone that spoke of permanence, of someone planning to stay. Inside, it was surprisingly homey, with handmade furniture and curtains at the windows and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Cole showed her around with obvious pride, pointing out improvements he'd made, plans he had for the future. "It's a good life out here," he said as they stood on the porch, looking out over his land. "Hard but good. You build something with your own hands, watch it grow, know that it's yours because you worked for it. That means something." "It's beautiful," Sarah said honestly. "I can see why you love it." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Can you see yourself here, Sarah? Not just visiting, but really here, as part of this?" Her heart hammered in her chest. She'd known this conversation was coming, had felt it building for months, but now that it was here, she found herself uncertain. "Cole, I'm not asking you to give up teaching," he said quickly. "I'd never ask that. I know how important it is to you, how good you are at it, but I'm asking if you can see building a life out here, with me, making this place ours instead of just mine." She looked at him, at this man who'd surprised her at every turn, who'd shown her respect and kindness and a patience she hadn't known she was looking for. She thought about the life he was offering, about waking up in this house every morning, about having someone to share her days with, about building something together. "There are complications," she said slowly. "You know there are. People will talk. Some won't approve. It might make things difficult for you, for your business." "Let them talk," he said with a fierceness that startled her. "I don't give a damn what anyone thinks. I care about you, Sarah. I care about the way you laugh when you think something's funny, the way you never back down from a challenge, the way you love those children you teach. I care about the conversations we have, the way I feel when I'm with you, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The rest of it, the opinions of people who can't see past the surface, that doesn't matter." "It matters," she insisted. "Maybe it shouldn't, but it does. We can't just pretend the world is different than it is." "I'm not pretending. I know exactly what the world is like. I've seen enough ugliness to last a lifetime. But I've also learned that you don't build a good life by living according to other people's fears and prejudices. You build it by being honest about what you want, about who matters to you, and then fighting like hell to protect it." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from happiness or fear or some combination of both, she couldn't say. "I need time to think," she said. "This is a big decision, Cole. It's not just about feelings. It's about practicalities, about what kind of life we could actually build together." Take all the time you need, he said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. I'm not going anywhere. But Sarah, I want you to know something. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I'm not the kind of man who says things like that easily, but you deserve to know where I stand. He took her back to town that afternoon, and they rode mostly in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. When he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered on her waist for a moment, and she saw in his eyes a vulnerability that made her chest ache. That night, lying in her narrow bed in her small room, Sarah wrestled with her decision. She thought about all the reasons to say no, to maintain her independence, to avoid the complications that would inevitably come. But she also thought about the way Cole looked at her, the way he respected her work, the way he made her laugh and challenged her thinking and made her feel, for the first time in her life, like she didn't have to choose between love and the life she wanted to build. And she thought about that room, that single bed, and what it represented. She'd come here alone, determined to make her own way, to prove that she didn't need anyone. But maybe the real courage wasn't in staying alone. Maybe it was in opening yourself up to the possibility of partnership, of sharing your life with someone who saw you for who you truly were and loved you, not despite your strength, but because of it. The next morning, she sought out Martha in the saloon's kitchen. The older woman looked up from her baking, her hands dusted with flour, her expression knowing. I expect you have some questions, Martha said before Sarah could speak. How did you know? I've been watching you and Cole circle each other for months. Wasn't hard to figure out something would come to a head eventually. She wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for Sarah to sit. What's troubling you? Sarah sat, grateful for the chance to voice her concerns to someone who might understand. He asked me to marry him, or close enough to it, and I want to say yes, but I'm scared. Scared of what it might mean, scared of how people will react, scared of losing myself in the process. Martha nodded slowly. Those are legitimate fears. I won't tell you they're not. Being a woman on the frontier is hard enough. Being a black woman married to a white man will bring its own challenges. Some folks will talk, some might cause trouble. That's the truth of it, and there's no point pretending otherwise. So you think I shouldn't do it? I didn't say that. Martha poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table to Sarah. I've been in this territory for 20 years, seen all sorts of folks come through. Some marriages work, some don't, and it usually has nothing to do with what the couple looks like and everything to do with whether they actually like each other, whether they're willing to work through the hard times. From what I've seen, you and Cole have got the important things. You respect each other. You make each other better. That's rarer than you might think. But my teaching will continue if that's what you want. Cole's not the kind of man who'd try to clip your wings. Hell, I think he loves you partly because you're so determined to fly. Martha took a sip of her coffee, studying Sarah over the rim. You came out here to build a life, didn't you? To make something of yourself on your own terms? Well, maybe this is part of that. Maybe the life you're meant to build includes him. Sarah spent the day teaching, but her mind was only half on her lessons. The children seemed to sense her distraction, and by afternoon, she gave up on structured learning and instead took them outside for a nature walk, pointing out different plants and birds, asking them to describe what they saw. It was during this walk, watching her students scatter across the prairie with their curiosity and joy, that she realized something important. She'd been so focused on proving she could make it alone that she'd started to see accepting help, accepting love, as a failure. But that wasn't right. The real failure would be in closing herself off from connection, from the possibility of building something with someone who valued her as much as she valued him. She could teach and be married. She could have her work and have love. She could be fully herself and part of a partnership. These things weren't mutually exclusive unless she made them so. That evening, instead of returning to the saloon, she hired a horse from the livery and rode out to the Triple H. It was sunset when she arrived, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink and gold, the kind of light that made everything seem magical and full of promise. She found Cole in the barn, tending to one of his horses, and when he looked up and saw her, his face transformed with hope and something that might have been joy. Sarah, he said, setting down the curry comb and moving toward her. I didn't expect— Yes, she said, interrupting him. My answer is yes. He stopped, as if her words needed a moment to register. Then he crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She felt him shaking, felt the rapid beat of his heart against her chest, and realized he'd been just as scared as she was, just as uncertain of the outcome. "You're sure?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look at her. "Because once we do this, I'm not letting you go. I'm going to love you and support you and probably drive you crazy sometimes, but I'm in this for the long haul. You need to be sure." "I'm sure," she said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "I want to build a life with you, Cole. I want to teach and have a home and face whatever comes together. I want all of it." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the chaste pecks she'd seen exchanged between courting couples in town. It was deep and hungry and full of promise. A kiss that spoke of passion held in check for too long and now finally unleashed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and laughed, the sound full of relief and happiness. "We should probably tell people," he said. "Before the gossip gets out of hand, let them gossip," she said, echoing his own words back to him. "We know what matters." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Martha standing as her witness and Cole's foreman standing as his. The town's reaction was mixed, as they'd expected. Some people were supportive, seeing only 2 people who cared for each other. Others were scandalized, muttering about propriety and tradition and what the world was coming to. A few were openly hostile, making their disapproval known in cutting remarks and cold shoulders. But Sarah found that it mattered less than she'd feared. She had her teaching, her students who continued to look at her with admiration and trust. She had Martha's friendship and the respect of those in town who valued character over prejudice. And most importantly, she had Cole, who stood by her side through every challenge, who defended her when necessary and supported her always, who never made her feel like loving him meant losing herself. The first night in their home together, the home that was now hers as much as his, Sarah stood in the doorway of their bedroom and looked at the large bed they would share. It was nothing like the narrow single bed in her room at the saloon, nothing like the confined space where she'd spent her first months in Redemption Ridge. This bed was wide and welcoming, covered in a quilt that Cole's mother had made, situated in a room with windows that looked out over the prairie she'd come to love. "What are you thinking?" Cole asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking about how different this is from my room at the saloon," she said. "That narrow bed, that small space. I thought that was my life, that small and contained existence. But this," she gestured at the room, the house, the life they were building together. "This is so much more than I imagined." "My room only has 1 bed," Cole said with a smile, "but it's big enough for both of us. For all the dreams we have, for all the nights we'll spend talking about our days, making plans, building our life together. It's not about the size of the bed or the room. It's about sharing it with someone who makes you want to be better, do more, dream bigger." She turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring into that kiss all the love and hope and determination she felt. "Tell me about forever," she whispered against his lips. "Tell me about the life we're going to build." And so he did. There in the doorway of their room, with the prairie wind singing through the eaves and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He told her about the children they might have, about expanding the ranch, about growing old together watching the seasons turn. He told her about supporting her teaching, about building a library for the school, about fighting alongside her for a world where their children wouldn't face the prejudice they'd known. She added her own dreams to his, talking about the students she'd teach, the minds she'd help shape, the difference she'd make. She spoke of writing letters to her mother, bringing her west if she'd come, creating a home that would be a haven for anyone who needed one. She talked about the books she wanted to read, the places she wanted to see, the person she wanted to become with him by her side. "Wild West love stories forever," Cole said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "That's what we'll have. Not the sanitized version in dime novels, but the real thing, messy and complicated and beautiful and true." Forever, Sarah agreed, and led him into their room, closing the door on the rest of the world. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle lost to disease and crops that failed. There were people who never accepted their marriage, who made life difficult in small ways and occasionally large ones. There were moments of doubt and fear, times when the weight of building a life in such unforgiving country seemed almost too much to bear. But there were also victories. The school grew, with Sarah eventually hiring an assistant teacher to help with the increasing number of students. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the territory. They became known not as the scandalous mixed couple, but as the Harrisons, respected members of the community who contributed generously to town improvements and never turned away someone in need. And through it all, they had each other. They had conversations that lasted deep into the night, debates and discussions that challenged and excited them both. They had quiet mornings over coffee discussing the day ahead. They had passionate arguments and equally passionate reconciliations. They had laughter and tears, triumph and setback. All the texture and complexity of a real life shared between real people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other. Day after day, year after year. Sarah never forgot that small room at the saloon. That narrow bed, that moment of standing at the threshold of something new. But she came to see it not as a limitation, but as a beginning. The first chapter in a story that grew richer and more complex with each passing year. That single bed had been enough for a woman alone, determined to prove herself. But this bed, their bed, was big enough for dreams they hadn't even imagined yet. For a love that grew rather than diminished with time. For a partnership that proved that the best stories weren't the ones where the hero conquered alone, but the ones where two people built something together that neither could have created on their own. On their 10th anniversary, Cole built a new schoolhouse, larger and better equipped than the original, with a small apartment attached, so Sarah wouldn't have to make the journey from the ranch in bad weather. The night they celebrated its completion, standing in the empty classroom as the sun set, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the courage it had taken to answer that advertisement so many years ago, to step into the unknown with nothing but hope and determination. "Thank you," she said to Cole, who stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. "For the schoolhouse? For all of it. For seeing me. For choosing me. For building this life with me." He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the solid strength of him. "You gave me just as much," he said. "You gave me a reason to build something that mattered, someone to share it all with. You gave me love, Sarah. The real kind, the kind that makes everything better and brighter and worth fighting for." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life that defied expectations and proved that love, real love, was stronger than prejudice, more enduring than hardship, more valuable than all the gold in the West. They'd taken their separate paths and woven them together into something new, something that belonged to both of them and to neither of them alone, something that would outlast them in the lives they'd touched and the legacy they'd built. The prairie stretched around them, vast and unforgiving and beautiful, the same prairie that had seemed so alien to Sarah that first day in Redemption Ridge. But it wasn't alien anymore. It was home, and the cowboy who'd once been a stranger was her partner, her love, the person who'd promised her Wild West love stories forever and had kept that promise every single day since. In the end, it wasn't about the size of the room or the number of beds. It was about finding someone who made you want to share your space, your dreams, your life. It was about building something together that was stronger and more beautiful than anything you could have built alone. It was about love. In all its messy, complicated, glorious reality, proving that the best stories weren't fairy tales, but the real lives of real people who chose to walk through the world side by side, come what may. And as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Sarah knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be, that every choice she'd made, every risk she'd taken, had led her to this moment, this life, this love. The West was still wild, life was still hard, but with Cole beside her and dreams still to pursue, she wouldn't have changed a single thing.